On June 2nd, Claudia Sheinbaum was elected to Mexico's highest office. A climate scientist and former mayor of Mexico City, Sheinbaum will now become the first woman president in the country's history. Her victory is part of a resounding win for the ruling Morena party and its allies, which gained a congressional majority in the elections. Now the Mexican left may be able to reshape the country's policy landscape through constitutional reform, something Sheinbaum's mentor, President Andrés Manuel López Obrador, tried repeatedly and unsuccessfully to do during his term. This episode features a conversation between Tony Payan, director of the Baker Institute Center for the U.S. and Mexico, and Lorena Becerra, a political scientist and pollster who previously worked at the newspaper Reforma. Tune in as they explore voter turnout on June 2nd and the implications of Morena's landslide victory for Mexican policy. I'm Ed Emmett, a fellow at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy in Houston, Texas, and this is Baker Briefing.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. My name is Tony Payan. I'm the director of the Center for the United States and Mexico at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. It is really a pleasure this morning to welcome Lorena Becerra, one of the sharpest emerging political analysts in Mexico. She is a former pollster at Reforma newspaper, and she now has her own consulting firm on polling. And of course, she is a political scientist and an animal lover, for what I can tell in her X account. We're going to be talking about the elections in Mexico. Everyone knows the results, and now we're trying to figure out what that means, what's coming up in the next few weeks, in the next few months, and of course, what we can expect in the next administration. So, Lorena, without any further ado, let me ask you, we have the results, an overwhelming grip for Morena and its allies in Mexico. What do you make of this result?
Well, first of all, it was a result that it took many of us by surprise. Even though it was very, very clear that Claudia Sheinbaum was probably going to be the winner of the presidential race, the margin was really something that was unexpected, particularly because of the signals that we saw from the opposition, from several groups that are not content with this government. And there were also numbers in the local races that pointed to a more competitive scenario, which in turn would probably have an effect on the national race and the distance between the first and the second places. With this result, basically Morena can do whatever they want in terms of constitutional reforms. And I think this is very alarming because we have seen that their intent is to weaken, if not eliminate, the National Electoral Institute, to disappear any sign of balance of powers. They are talking about a judicial reform where judges would be popularly elected and obviously a partisan judicial system. Also the INAI, which is the National Transparency Institute, it has already been very, very weakened because the president refused to appoint some of the members, so there are empty seats. But they also want to get rid of the INAI. I think the militarization would deepen. Claudia Sheinbaum is in favor of a military head of the National Guard. She's also in favor of what we call the prisión preventiva oficiosa, which is the ability of the authorities to put someone in jail without the process, without the due process, because they are accused of severe crimes. They can make a long list or they can make it, like a organized crime. Anybody can be accused of organized crime and then put in jail without trial. So I think all of these possibilities point towards a future of, the consolidation or the initiation of an authoritarian regime. And it's very, very bad news.
So Mexico breaks away from North America, so to speak, from the more liberal democracies and joins populist regimes in Latin America. We've seen this happen in Argentina. We've seen it in Peru. We've seen it in Bolivia, of course, in Nicaragua and Cuba and Venezuela. So this speaks to a major international trend, really, that we're seeing in many, many different countries, and that Mexico had, to a large extent, resisted. And now it's essentially joining a very different club than the liberal democracies in Europe and North America. Would that be a correct interpretation of what you're seeing?
Yes, I think so, particularly because Claudia Sheinbaum talked very much about the popular mandate, which is also something that López Obrador believes. And I think with the percentage, 60% of vote, she is going to interpret this basically as she's going to embody the will of the people without the acknowledging the existence of the 30% that did not vote for her. And the role of the opposition, at least in Congress, is basically just testimonial. They are not going to have any way to limit the decisions. And an additional thing, aside from what they already want to do with the court, we are already facing a turnover in court. One of the judges, the Supreme Court judges, who has been more institutional, to say it that way, was stepping down because his term limit is ending in November. And with that, the court no longer has the majority to rule certain laws unconstitutional. They lose the veto, the constitutional veto. So yes, definitely. And one, I would add another concern, talking about the populism, is that they really do not have a lot of spending margins. So Claudia Sheinbaum is going to have to make some reforms. I would be very concerned about a pension reform where they would try to use the money from pensions to continue with this populist agenda in social programs, the pet projects, the refinery, etc.
Yeah, there are many people that say that, well, she's a scientist, she's a doctor, she's rational, perhaps more rational than Mr. López Obrador, and they try to give her the benefit of the doubt. That was the case in 2018 with Mr. López Obrador. Many people thought that he would actually come back to the middle, would be a lot more moderate, would be a lot more inclusive of opposing views. What do you expect out of Sheinbaum as president? Will she truly move to the center, include other voices, moderate, or do you really see the radicalization of an ongoing project?
Well, she has outspokenly said that she supports López Obrador's agenda. López Obrador, a few months ago, pointed to his 20-point reform that includes the pension reform, it includes the Supreme Court reform, the electoral reform, and she has outspokenly supported this. She asked for the vote so that they would do this plan. So I would be very surprised to see her move to the center. I also think that at least for the next couple of months, López Obrador is going to be very, very present in the decision-making process. Yesterday, we already saw that he announced, even though she is the president-elect, he announced that the Minister of Finance is going to remain in his seat with her. So I think he's going to be very involved. And one more thing that concerns me is that he's going to have 1 month of this new legislature with all this power. So I wouldn't be surprised if he decides to push some reforms starting September.
Yeah. So we're essentially looking at a mandate by the Mexican people. But lots of folks in Mexico actually supported this project. They came out in droves, they voted, and they obviously gave them an overwhelming majority. There's been, however, some complaints that there was a lot of manipulation. It was not really a free and fair election altogether. Bit by bit, the evidence is coming out. Organized crime played a role. Of course, the governors played a role. They used public resources. The president certainly thumbed the scale in favor of his candidate against the law. He was admonished dozens of times. So can we really talk about Mexico's electoral system and whether this electoral system is truly free and fair?
There are two things that we need to look into. First, yes, this was not an equal process. The president violated the law every day, getting involved. He had at least 50 medidas cautelares, which are like warnings of his misconduct from the electoral authorities. We had the governors use public resources, as you said. That in itself constitutes a very unequal process. And then talking about the election right now, there are several inconsistencies emerging. So right now we're looking at a case in the state of Mexico where the advantage of the Morena candidate was said to be 12 points. They asked for a recount because they're looking at the papers from the polling booths, and that difference went down to 5. That's a lot. So apparently there are some inconsistencies with the numbers itself. So it was not only the entire process that was unequal, that was full of irregularities, that was full of violations of the law, that was full of the use of public resources. Apparently, the voting itself has some warning signs. I do not think that this means that Claudia Sheinbaum did not win, but maybe this means that some of the margins are smaller in the other races.
Yes. And I think even in the local races, Yucatan, for example, was expected to go PAN. It was a bastion of panismo in Mexico, so to speak, and yet it went the other way. They certainly won Mexico City, which was also expected to be lost by Morena. There seems to be a consensus. Clearly, the Mexican people chose this. There is a huge middle class that voted for other candidates, 30% for Galvez and 10% for Movimiento Ciudadano or Maynes, the candidate. That's 40% of folks that didn't vote for this particular project. Do you think that Sheinbaum in the future will call them to the table? Mr. López Obrador never met with them. Will Sheinbaum call them to the table and at a minimum ask them, what's your vision for the country? What's your agenda? What do you want? Will she broaden her conversation with the opposition as opposed to Mr. López Obrador, or she's just simply going to ram her program through Congress and then govern for essentially what is 60%, 58% of the folks that voted for her?
I think before answering that, I also have to say that a lot of the former PRI, some PAN members already joined her project. We even had the former candidate of the PRI in Estado de Mexico join her project 2 days before the campaigns were over. So she already has a lot of the priistas and panistas in her project, because I would not say maybe she's going to include all of them in her team. So I think, first of all, they are already there, a lot of them. And then the ones that are left, I think that they are so small because López Obrador was facing a different type of opposition. There were several governors from different parties. At the beginning, he had a super majority in Congress, but that was because of the rules of assigning, of seat assigning, and because of his allies. I think Claudia Sheinbaum has no reason to interpret the votes that she had as an attention to look into other voices. I would be happily surprised to see her take into account dissident voices. We have seen her as a candidate who does not like criticism. She does not seem to believe in balance of powers. She believes that it's better to have everybody think the same. She does not support the critical or independent media. We have evidence that she was very upset with an interview she had from Tercer Grado, which is an opinion program. She was very upset because they asked her challenging questions, and not even that challenging. I think they really did not do a very good job. So I would be very, very surprised if she took into account any part of the opposition.
The markets have reacted. Lots of business houses in the United States have already said that the country risk is going up. They don't have any faith that Mexico is moving in the right direction. And the markets have sent a message. 6% of the stock market in Mexico, I think, was shaved off yesterday, and the peso began to depreciate. Do you expect any other signals from the markets that this is a dangerous majority in Mexico? And I mean, Mexicans obviously can choose whatever they want. They'll have to live with the consequences. They'll have to deal with this on a daily basis. We've seen the public policy failures of the López Obrador administration. And if she wants to continue with that, fine, that is what they chose. But the markets have their own opinion and they will react. What can we expect?
I think that the reaction yesterday from the markets was very, very clear. This scenario makes them very nervous because there's no guarantee that there will be rule of law and transparency in the country. And I think this was a surprising result for everyone because, as I said at the beginning, we all expected her to become president, but not like this. We were expecting to have some type of contention, some type of balance in Congress. And even the polls that signaled that she may win with a large margin, even those polls suggested that the constitutional majority was very, very unlikely. So I think that at least the international community and the financial community is going to be looking to see what her first steps are. But if we're talking about times, A very important one is first when she announces her cabinet. And I think yesterday's announcement was a reaction to what they saw in the markets. Second, when the new legislature takes power in September, whether López Obrador is going to try to do something. Then when she takes office in October, and then when they have to approve the budget in December. So I think those are the signals that we have to look into to see what at least her first year is going to be like. But I wouldn't be surprised, for instance, if right now some of the middle classes or the better off middle classes start pulling out some of their money from the country and start making their own decisions to leave the country, but at least have their financial resources secure.
One more question. What do you think Mr. López Obrador's role would be? You already mentioned that he's probably going to be very involved. He certainly gave her a list of things to do, constitutional changes that he wants to pursue. He might do it in September. He's certainly going to try to set the agenda. Do you think that he'll be breathing over her neck and say, hey, you were handpicked by me to pursue this agenda. Don't deviate too much. This is a larger project than you or me. We're taking the country in a certain direction. How much do you expect him to really interfere in the next election? We haven't seen this in Mexico. Even powerful presidents like Mr. Salinas were essentially exiled and had to leave the country, and all power to their successors. Do you expect this to be different?
So in general, that is what we have seen. We have seen that the presidents that are elected from the same party try to mark a very, very important distance from the predecessors. But in particular, right now, I think Claudia Sheinbaum owns her victory to López Obrador. And López Obrador still controls Morena. He's very important in a figure in Morena. In the entire electoral process, deciding which candidates were going to be placed for governor races, for senator, congressman, etc., he was the one who decided who the candidates were going to be. So a lot of these loyalties are also his. And let's not forget that she's facing a referendum vote on her fourth year. So I think he still has a lot of clout. So even if she would want to break away from him, first she needs to take the grip of the party, which is a very undisciplined party. So I think she has very low margin to break away from him, even if she wanted to. And I have my doubts that she would want to.
Now, the challenges that Ms. Sheinbaum will face are not small. I mean, public policy under the López Obrador administration in just about every rubric has been a failure. She'll face a very tight fiscal policy that now has a 6% budget deficit. Already, the country is borrowing in the international markets, one off, two off. The markets will let it go. If it becomes a habit, then it becomes a problem. The energy sector, we've already seen the blackouts and the brownouts all over the country. It's fully capped. We've seen the grip of organized crime in the country, the public safety and security situation. We've already seen that 60% of the country is under water stress with very little investment in water conservation. We've seen that climate change policy is practically null, and on and on. We can go on in every single of these ticking bombs and see a very complicated scenario. At what point do you think that she will have to change courses, face reality, or will she push with policies that are essentially taking Mexico in a very complicated direction?
Well, yes, precisely because of that, I was thinking about the pension reform and other reforms. She needs to do a tax reform because she does not have enough money. And I think borrowing is not going to be the solution. The credit scores in Mexico are okay, but we have been downgraded in several of the ratings. So I think she's on the limit of that. And I think she's just going to try to get money from the middle classes and from the pensions. They already have the Afore reform where they are taking money from the retirement funds. I think she's not going to try to moderate her agenda for financial purposes or for fiscally responsible reasons.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think the challenges are going to be quite a few. Mexico's foreign policy is also somewhat deteriorated. The infrastructure is deteriorating. I mean, the challenges are enormous. The legacy that Mr. López Obrador is leaving in public policy is a very, very complicated legacy, and I'm sure that she'll just have to face up to that. Lorena, I really appreciate your insights. Thank you very much. It's been really very good. And for those of us who are political analysts, political scientists, pollsters, I guess we'll have a lot of work in the future, trying to read what's coming up day by day, month by month, and of course, year by year, and see where Mexico is going in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We'll be talking very soon.
Baker Briefing is brought to you by the Baker Institute for Public Policy, which provides meaningful, nonpartisan policy analysis on the most critical challenges facing Texas, the United States, and the world. It is produced by Victoria Jupp, Shannon Moriarty, and Karina Zimmel. AV production is led by Kevin Young. Be sure to visit us at bakerinstitute.org to learn more. Thanks for listening.